lovely afternoon it is. I think that you've all heard enough of your Vice-Chancellor's voice for one weekend, and Simon Schama needs no introduction, and so I won't, other than to say that it is an enormous pleasure and a privilege to welcome back a very distinguished alumnus and an old friend. So Simon.
Thank you. Everybody hearing me? First boring question, yes. Because I'm quite capable of, doing without this technology. My father, who, in mistaken benevolence, used to train me for sort of public debates as well as other embarrassing Shakespeare performances when I was 8 years old, only had one crucial piece of advice, which he would project from the back of the hall usually and say, "Louder, Simon, louder," which in some horrible way has applied not to my voice, my clothes, my general demeanour, as you know. So, it's really wonderful being here. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. I find it amazing, really, to call my old friend Alison Richards, as she's quite properly called, Vice-Chancellor, will all somehow become, without noticing it, institutions, really. Or in my case, about to be surrendered to an institution, as I enter what Gore Vidal rather accurately described as the springtime of senility. Example of which you may be about to witness. On the subject of which, actually, it was wonderful. I helped move my daughter, who's here, into Christ's for a course in an MPhil, from which she's going to get a wonderful refreshment of education. And it made me think, as I went into first quarter, of a moment when sort of all history was really summed up for me by conversation passing between two American ladies, just coming out of the Yaled-up heraldic gateway, and one turned to the other and said, "Oh, Martha, don't you just adore history? It's so old." Not exactly what they meant. So that's quite enough jokes for you for this afternoon. Now, settle down, class. There will be an exam as you go out, actually. They did tell you this, didn't they, actually? Yes. Two kinds of abolition, two routes for it. The moment, I think, when I realised how extraordinary the intensity and ubiquity of the proceedings commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade was actually while standing in a pulpit, something to which I'm absolutely, as a kind of not very observant Jew, not accustomed, in Fulham Parish Church. And the vicar, the current incumbent, Reverend Joe Hawes, had done something absolutely wonderful, not inviting me to stand in the pulpit, but that was sort of part of the deal. He discovered that the great, rather still undersung hero of the abolitionist movement, a man called Granville Sharp, who died in 1813 and whose history kick-starting the abolitionist movement went back a long way. It went back, in fact, to a moment I'll describe a bit later on, to 1765. When he died, had not been granted what was his due, a proper, as the Reverend Hawes put it, church funeral. Instead, he'd had some difference. He was a cantankerous figure. But what would the world be without figures of richly creative cantankerousness? And he'd had some sort of obscure argument over... They thought he was a sort of, disguised Methodist. In those days, that was a shocking thing to be, masquerading as somebody orthodoxly still within the Church of England. So the vicar, rather peevishly, had denied him his church funeral. Instead, there'd been a kind of summary funeral in the churchyard where Granville Sharp is buried in a rather beautiful tomb. And the vicar had not really asked anybody, but all of abolitionist London, Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson and their friends, had come, irritating the vicar even further. So the Reverend Joe Hawes decided, almost 200 years later, 190-something years later, to sort of make amends and actually give him his church funeral. And there came the Sharps with their inimitably sort of rather bony, heroically bony features, would be the way I describe them, looking almost unnervingly like portraits we have of Granville, including a beautiful painting painted by Johann Zoffany, the court artist who painted the Sharp family. Sharp family, as I want to say, actually were famous for floating concerts, which they all played musical instruments. And they then owned barges and riverboats, and they would go up and down the Thames, mooring at Chiswick and at Fulham and at Chelsea. And occasionally the King and the Prince of Wales came, but these concerts were famous. And indeed, one of the main objections that Granville Sharp had to the iniquity of slavery and to the abolition of the slave trade was that it was a violation of the holy ordinance of harmony between men and women as well, and races, as well as in other orders of the political universe too. So Granville, in came the rest of the Sharps, and in came everybody from that around London and members of the black community. And I had to do my thing in the pulpit, which I discharged as best as I was able. But the moment where the centuries simply collapsed and folded into themselves was an absolutely amazing moment before, early on, at this moment, where English horns were played, and by two soloists playing music composed by Granville Sharp. But those were Sharp's own horns, in fact. The provenance was perfect. I think his nephew or niece had given them to the Horniman Museum, which is a museum of classical instruments in London, have been preserved, and all the documentation was absolutely impeccable. And these things were really quite hard to play, valves and so on. I mean, musicians among you will know better than I. But the sense in which actually the horn-playing Granville Sharp, the sort of hero of early abolitionism, could be heard through his music at that moment of reparation to the rather, as I say, act of peevish oblivion that had been imposed on him by a ticked-off vicar, was really quite wonderful. And it was one of those moments, as I say, when it seemed to be the immediacy of the celebration of what there was in rather genteel form of British culture that got it to sort of be ardently agitating about this, what Granville Sharp himself called the accursed thing. That was his name for the enormity of the slave trade. And you probably can't possibly have missed other forms of commemoration. I'll always remember the sound of African drums in the nave of Westminster Abbey on the day the Queen came. And it was wonderful. The Queen was, you may remember, on this occasion, rather fiercely upbraided by a member of the sort of the black community in grand sort of tribal robes. And this upbraiding, which we could hear, was taking place in the choir, asked very much the hoi polloi, sort of in the main part of the nave. And he heard it going on. It went on in a British way. I mean, if it had been in the United States, many people would have been shot, actually, in the first 3 minutes. But they weren't shot. And next to me, rather wonderfully, speaking of, sort of gloriously benevolent inbreeding, was a descendant of William Wilberforce, Kate Davson. Still lives in Yorkshire, family still lives in Yorkshire, and she read a piece from one of Wilberforce's speeches, which was deeply, deeply moving. We were talking a little bit after the incident, when the service was over. And I thought she would sort of mind. It happened almost immediately after she finished speaking. And she said, oh no, she said, of course, they are very upset about all this. That's exactly what Wilberforce would have said, He wouldn't have minded at all. And then there are many wonderful things. Westminster Hall, the great, where Charles I is tried, and Richard II's great Curia Regis. Marvellous little exhibition organised by my friend, the Speaker of the House of Lords, Helene Hayman, where you can see, I think it's still up actually, you can see Thomas Clarkson's travelling box, complete with horrible manacles and sort of hideous ironware that Clarkson used to take round the country. So many marvellous day in the British Museum where I read a little bit to kids sitting, 9 and 10-year-olds, told them about who Clarkson was and Ella Dick, Rihanna. Lots and lots of moments of commemoration, more than one can imagine. The film, Amazing Grace, and so on. And there is... do I indulge in a piece of shameless self-promotion? Oh, why not? Rough Crossings becomes a play which is touring the country and opens in London next week. You're not under any obligation to see it, but no one will be let out of here alive before buying a ticket. And in America... one thing has been missing from all this extraordinary, and actually Christopher Leslie Brown, who's written very, very eloquently, my colleague at the moment at Columbia, who wrote a book called Moral Capital, which is an absolutely magisterial book about the movement. Christopher said to me the other day, he said he was astonished, actually, at the degree and intensity and seriousness, as well as the attempt to reach a broad public, of this particular commemoration. He said, I don't remember anything like it in British history, and he's right, recent British history, I think he's right. And then, of course, one crucial fact gets forgotten, and that is that Thomas Jefferson, as president, signed an act abolishing the slave trade into law 3 weeks before George III, in the very same month, in March 1807. And so one would think, actually, that there'd be an equivalent, or something like, at least an echo, really, of the same sort of commemorative attentiveness in the United States. Not a peep. There is some talk of a commemorative stamp, since no one, except really, wanting to send you yet more catalogues for redecorating your kitchen, or, dunning letters for back payments on unpaid parking tickets, really bothers really all that much with snail mail anymore. And since also commemorative stamps will also, in the United States, tend to include more pictures of native wildflowers and lichens and mosses and liverworts, possibly, you could ever want. Not a really particularly striking form of commemoration, if indeed it happens. There is some talk in the United States of having a monument. There's sort of monument mania going on in the mall in Washington at the moment, to black soldiers in the history of the American Republic, including, it's said, but I'd be amazed if this happens, the black loyalist soldiers, the soldiers who fought for the king, under the terms of the Lord Dunmore's proclamation that I'll talk about in a bit. That may or may not happen. Charles Rangel, one of our local congressmen in New York, actually urged and succeeded in having the 101st present Congress, it is the 101st, yes, I believe it is, pass an act of commemoration and congratulations, remembering the abolition of the slave trade, but it was the British slave trade that he got his fellow members of Congress to acclaim, not noticing that actually it had happened in the United States as well. Why? Why this extraordinary discrepancy? What does it tell us? Well, in the first place, I think actually it tells us, I was talking about this a little earlier on today, and there is a sense in which, of course, multicultural Britain, for better or worse, and very much from my point of view, for better, when not a craven piece of political correctness, has woken up to want to have a dialogue about what Britain has been in its imperial years and in its post-imperial years, and that's all to the good. But I think in the United States case, and there are, I'm sure, lots of Americans among you here, and so I'd welcome contentious interruption. Well, of course I wouldn't, but I'm bound to say that. You can all ask questions, provided they're really easy. But I think in the United States, it's fair to say, you can't possibly say about the United States now that it's uninterested or cool towards consuming history books in its literature, or indeed even on television. We're about to get a multi-part epic history by Ken Burns, who made the phenomenally powerful series on the Civil War, this time called The War, meaning the Second World War, and it's entirely about American service in the Second World War. There were, my memory as an historian may not be serving me too well, but I seem to remember there were other soldiers involved, actually, on the Allied side, just a few. But there we get The War. But it's true, I think, actually, that the more grievous a public sense of perplexity about the present war, or indeed about present history, or where present history has led the Republic, the more successful history books have become at presenting a moment in American history of kind of prelapsarian splendor. The Founding Fathers, a moment in American history where all the leaders seem to be wise, strong, virtuous, intelligent, and victorious. So that history, hence, partly, it's understandable, wanting to recover such a prelapsarian movement when the future of America was boundlessly possible and open, and the inconsistencies would somehow find their way in something other than the slaughters that eventually came about, of course, in the mid-19th century Civil War. So that biographies of Hamilton and Jefferson and so on, huge, great doorstoppers, very, very good. David McCullough, John Adams, and so on. And Ron Cherno's wonderful book about Hamilton, Walter Isaacson's on Franklin, are very, very popular for this reason, because they seem to feature a cast over whom a shadow had not yet grown. So history is sort of treated, I would say, and here I may be a bit churlish, but it's treated, I would say, in a consolatory manner. The tone is one of elegiac consolation rather than inquisitively. And of course, actually, the word historia comes from the beginning of Herodotus' history, where historia means an inquiry. Essentially, from the minute Western history is born, it poses itself as a self-interrogation, a question, an inquiry. And the great glory and strength and honour and integrity of the kind of Western history that was born with Thucydides in particular, in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, was that it was a kind of gadfly for the complacent. Thucydides is, of course, a protagonist in the Peloponnesian Wars. He's a general. And it's very telling to me that that extract, which is used all over the United States, including my own university, although there's more read of Thucydides than just this, is the famous funeral oration of Pericles, in which the case is set out for the glory of dying for freedom, a speech which Thucydides himself, who was very tough on Herodotus for making things up fabulously in the literal old sense of that, but Thucydides said was what Pericles might have said as he'd heard report from someone who claimed he'd been a witness. And we'd never be allowed to get away with that now, actually. Yes, I actually, I'm sometimes taken to task for, excesses of imaginative reconstruction, moi. But in fact, I'm very careful in Rough Crossings and other history books to avoid this. So, for example, if I say, it was, as I do, at the beginning of one chapter, the rain stopped just long enough for the freshly hanged man to be properly burned. I knew that it was raining every single day in Charleston because Henry Lawrence had written to his son every single day, and he always began with a kind of weather report, so I knew that. Although I was taken to task by Noel Malcolm, this was a chastening moment, really. I think there was one moment where I dared to say of a very important summit conference, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, between George Washington and the last Commander-in-Chief of British forces in America, a sort of standard imperial nitwit, but tremendously good egg called Sir Guy Carleton. And they're there in front of a small house in Tapan, where the summit conference took place, and there was a duck pond. We know there was a duck pond. We know there were ducks commented on by, and there were engravings of ducks. And some demon in me said in the sentence, and the ducks paddled around oblivious to the moments of the... And Noah Malcolm said, how does Schama know they're oblivious? I thought, what was the alternative? The ducks paddled around possibly oblivious or possibly riveted by the mighty... Yeah. So, where were we, actually? Yes, so there is the sense, actually, I think, in Thucydides, in sort of the sense in which really, as I say, sort of history is, it may be excessively used as a means of consolation for the perplexed. And it's in a peculiar way, the kind of quietness of the American response to the commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade is entirely in keeping with what we know to be the case, unlike the gorgeous, sort of hyperbolically trumpeted, the scenes in Parliament in early 1807 are gorgeously ripe with the most fabulous oratory, particularly from Charles James Fox, and most spectacularly of all from Samuel Romilly, the Solicitor General then, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But what's interesting in America, again, famous for its sort of excesses of sort of foot-stamping demagoguery in Congress, even then, and very sort of loud and raucous rough-and-tumble politics, absolute, almost as though it wasn't happening. Jefferson barely, if you look at the private papers of Jefferson and Madison and most of the kind of protagonists in it, it passed in through the House of Representatives by fairly easily, but there were not many people there to vote. Matthew Mason, excellent historian, has pointed out that in the papers and diaries and journals is barely mentioned. What Jefferson and pretty much everybody else in politics were more concerned with were the effects on the American economy of the Napoleonic intervention, trade blockades, and the British response to it, the British embargo, and British naval activity, to the continuing trouble with the Barbary Corsairs in North Africa, and particularly to the Aaron Burr conspiracy, as it was thought to be, and indeed was, in the West. So you have to really hunt for people's mind on this enormously important issue. Now, there were debates, and it's very telling in America. In other words, there was sort of a sort of inclination, and the inclination to not really make this front and centre an issue seems to me also of a piece with why there's a reluctance to think it's an event worth celebrating in America now. And that is, of course, while in Britain it seems to point the British Empire, which had been, in trouble after the War of the American Revolution, and was still facing a very daunting enemy in this gigantic Napoleonic Empire, as it was then, point Britain in a new direction, which I want to talk about very much, because actually the language used by the major protagonists, from Wilberforce and Fox, is all about the indispensability of committing an act of virtue for the future of the English nation. It's all very often it's described rather egregiously as England, not yet Britain. And in America, of course, actually, the abolition of the slave trade is seen as a kind of blip still on the route, retrospectively, to the much greater tragic carnage of what would be the Civil War. So it seems to me merely a kind of almost a misleading moment in a much larger sort of teleology which leads towards this ferocious reckoning that will happen at Bull Run and Antietam and Gettysburg. And it's very telling that most of the protagonists were aware in some ways of what the stakes were in the abolition of the slave trade. Jefferson, beginning with the president himself. The president, of course, famously still a slaveholder, unlike George Washington, who'd freed slaves at his death, or more accurately, when his wife, Martha, finally died. Jefferson still very much a slaveholder, and with, of course, as we know, had for a long time a slave mistress. But Jefferson, the man who had tried to insert into the Declaration of Independence, because he was so aware of the inconsistency between arguing for liberty for America while at the same time being presiding over a slave-owning world. Jefferson had tried to insert an absolutely unequivocal paragraph about the abolition of slavery, only to have it sort of stricken out, of course, by particular delegates to the Continental Congress coming from the lower or deep South and prepared to accept that. Jefferson deeply conflicted, knowing, along with everybody else, even people from the North like John Adams, that the price of becoming America, of winning the war, was that North and South should stay together. The war would not be won unless the views of the South were conceded to in terms of not interfering with what they called their property. So a Faustian deal had pretty much been made at the moment of the Revolution to put off this great issue, not just of the institution of slavery itself, but of the trade. There was some jitteriness in South Carolina and in the Deep South, in any case, of a not particularly altruistic kind, about the effects of unlimited imports of slaves from Africa. There was nervousness that the demography, which in Virginia was something almost at one point 40%, I think, of the population of Virginia in the 1790s were unfree blacks. Population situation might get completely out of control, and because there were rebellions very fierce rebellions going on in Suriname and in St. Vincent and for a while in Jamaica, that if there were too many imports of enslaved Africans, the situation may simply sort of get out of control. So some move from a kind of containment, pragmatic, to simply stabilize the numbers. Nonetheless, the issue is put off. It comes up again at the debates on the Constitution in 1789, where it's put off again. And the reason is that delegates from South Carolina, for example, like John Rutledge, and many others, threatened to secede. They threatened exactly what would be threatened in Abraham Lincoln's day. Should, in fact, the slave trade, with the possible consequence of the eventual abolition of slavery, be foisted on them, and should their states' rights to actually secure, as again they put it, their own property, be infringed in any way. So in 1889, again, the issue is said will be put off for 20 years. And those 20 years saw the poison chalice of slave America brim and overflow. More slaves were imported into the United States and, it should be said, into the Caribbean Empire of Britain than at any other point during the 18th century period before it. Something like 50,000 slaves during that period, those 20 years, were imported into South Carolina alone. Huge numbers. Huge numbers. And, of course, those who were in control of the slave economy assumed simply by process of natural reproduction they wouldn't, supposing there would be a ban as a result of that when the 20 years of delay elapsed, then, in fact, they'd have a sufficient stock of slaves, as again they put it, not to need any further imports. So Jefferson really, quite clearly, had a kind of mixed conscience about that, but not so mixed that he was prepared to do anything until this particular moment. The Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of gigantic swathes of American territory, which did what, I think, quintupled the territorial size of America, something like that. Again, made him a pragmatist about needing at all times to keep the South with him. John Randolph, in the debates over the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, still continued with the same sort of language. He said that he wanted it to be understood and have it in writing that Congress would disavow all constitutional right, title, authority whatsoever by any legislative act to modify or affect the right of property of masters of slaves that were not imported after 1807. So if, in fact, that would not be the case, he simply said, let us secede and go home. There were debates in Congress when the Act for the Abolition of Slave Trade over what would happen to slaves who are... If the slave trade was made illegal, then, of course, the American Navy could intercept illegal ships that were full of slaves, as the Royal Navy was about to do. And the issue is what would happen to the probably thousands and thousands of slaves, and there were about 20,000 who would indeed fall into this category. What would happen to them under the authority of the American Navy? And the South simply wanted them brought back to the South and auctioned. The issue was, because they said we can't possibly tolerate a large population of free blacks alongside our slaves. Here's Peter Early from the state of Georgia. If free blacks were allowed into the South, say, for example, brought back to a port like Savannah or Charleston, we must, in self-defense, gentlemen, he said on the floor of Congress, get rid of them in some way. We must either get rid of them or they us. There is no alternative. Not one of them would be left alive in a year. So you can see this sort of grim, ominous prognosis that colours the debates. Now, if we listen to... So there is, in some sense, in which this moment, the abolition of the slave trade, is a moment that's pregnant with the possibility of the unmaking of the American nation. In Britain, it is, and I don't think we should claim any, egregious self-congratulation about this. It just happened to be, or maybe we should, I don't know. Certainly tribute to Wilberforce and co. But certainly it's the case in Britain, I believe, that just the opposite obtained. It's a weird paradox that the Americans are in this bind, American Northerners, if you like, in this bind, in this grip of this Faustian bargain that had been made at the time of the Revolution, as a result of their victory. Our defeat in America had led to an extraordinary moment of introspection about what will Britain, as it now was, certainly was since 1801, Linda Colley is very eloquent and brilliant about this. What will Britain and the British Empire be? And there ought to be a debate on such a thing. And here, for example, is the voice of... here is, for example, the voice of Castlereagh. Not really famous as a particularly liberal figure, quite the opposite. The famously reactionary Viscount Castlereagh in the House of Lords at the time of the debate. Here's what he says. I think this a proposition on which no human being can entertain a doubt, namely that the slave trade is a great evil in itself. So resort to universal principles. That certainly also happened among abolitionists in America. But then he goes on to say, it is the duty and policy of Parliament, to abrogate that evil and to extirpate it, being a stain on the national character. This is extreme arch-reactionary Tory saying this. Here is the Solicitor General Romilly, who I've mentioned, a great and magnificently grandiloquent figure. The eloquence is actually exhilarating, intoxicating to read after all these years. And Wilberforce is by no means the greatest of the orators, I think, actually, but not bad. God, it was a great time when rhetoric was... I gave a speech to the Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard, who very generously asked me, called The Fate of Eloquence in the Age of Ozzy Osbourne, which was sort of some grim verdict, really, on what had happened to it. There was a time when all American high school students, in fact, to graduate from university as well, had to read works of rhetoric. You can go to the university library here, I know, and certainly Butler Library at Columbia University, and see shelf after shelf of the practice and art of rhetoric. You know, would that were the case now. And the greatest, most famous textbook was written by a Scottish divine, as they say, and professor called Hugh Blair, no relation, who was the book to read in the United States. Well, here's Romilly, definitely a Blairite. Now, sir, after it has been proved, after it has been ascertained by indisputable evidence that this trade cannot be carried on without the most iniquitous practice, that rapine, robbery and murder are the foundations of it, that men are falsely accused and on false accusations condemned to supply its victims, that the most disgusting cruelties attended, I do say this trade ought not to be suffered to continue for an hour. It is a stain upon, again the phrase, our national reputation, and ought to be wiped away. Since the period we originally resolved to abolish this trade, viz. 1796, no less than 360,000 individuals have been torn from the coast of Africa to supply this trade. Such is the accumulation of guilt that hangs on the English nation at this moment. And the sense really of needing a great national reformation around which this campaign could build its support was extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily strong. And it extended really into all the sort of citadels of English public life, into law, into religion, into the economy, as well as into politics. And as I say, the figure who, because he is so unlikely, and was certainly not an orator at all, but a very brilliant and fierce and tenacious terrier-like polemicist, Granville Sharp, who I already mentioned to you, in Sharp's own mind, this was what was at stake. Sharp, interestingly, for those of you who don't know about him, was the son of an Archdeacon of York and of Durham, of Northumberland, and the grandson of the Archbishop of York. But he was sort of dreamy, belonged to a family. One brother was surgeon to the king, one of the surgeons to the king, another brother was an ironmonger, another brother was vicar still up in the North Country. He was a sort of dreamy, rather unworldly person who was mostly interested in biblical exegetics. And then really one day, the amazing sort of epiphany happened. Sometimes these really do happen in history. His brother used to have rehearsals at his brother's surgery near the Tower of London in Mincing Lane. And they had a free day for the poor and destitute of the city in East London. And there was a big kind of queue always to get into the surgery. And one day, Granville was coming out from the rehearsal, and he fell over, almost literally, stumbled over, body of a black man called Jonathan Strong, who'd been beaten up so horribly and thrown into the street to die. He was covered in blood. he'd be beaten up by a sadistic master and just chucked away, and had crawled, as we know from Strong's own account of it, which is kept in most moving letter in Granville Sharp's bits of Granville Sharp's correspondence that are preserved in the New York Historical Society, oddly enough. They take him in. He takes the black in to William, and William is a doctor, and they clean up his wounds. And then he goes to, I think, St. Bart's Hospital, and he stays there. And after he is relatively better, he bears the marks of this thrashing. He'd been thrashed, pistol whipped so hard with the gun that his master's gun had broken, actually, on his face, on his jaw. And they find him a job as a messenger, essentially, and also as a kind of coachman to an apothecary. And he goes about his job for 2 or 3 years. And one day he's actually riding, I think, as postilion in the coach of fetching from the dispensary to the apothecary. And his old master sees him, and he thinks he was supposed to be dead, and he looks pretty damn good and finely dressed to me. And he does what many slave masters in London did when they happened to see runaway slaves or slaves who disappeared from their place of lodging. He hires slave catchers who are all over the street of London, with the object being to catch, as it were, their property for resale, and they are forcibly taken into the ships at Tilbury or Deptford and then taken off to the West Indies or America for resale. And this poor man is actually taken as, escaped property. But something has happened to Jonathan Strong. He's learnt to read and write, and he sends a message to Granville Sharp, who, after not remembering much about Jonathan Strong, comes to the prison where he's being held, a poultry counter, and actually secures through habeas corpus the temporary release, and it goes, complicated story, it goes to trial, but he wins. It was from that moment that Sharp decides that he must master the law. And Sharp then embarks, and it's a long story which I'm certainly not going to tell you now, but embarks on an amazing autodidact process of educating himself in English common law, and on a series of court challenges, sometimes done with professional advocates and solicitors, sometimes not, sometimes himself, with the Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, which ends famously in July 1772 with Mansfield's reluctant ruling in the case of one James Somerset, another escaped slave who was going to be resold, that there was no right of a master to coercively transport a figure. That ruling was not to say slavery is illegal in England, only that an escaped slave could not be transported back to the West Indies against their will. Of course, it would be against their will. But it was taken by both blacks and whites alike. We have a very moving account in the newspapers of those days of the blacks crowding into King's Bench, which was then in Westminster Hall, and bowing to Mansfield and his 2 associate judges when they took it as a sign that slavery had indeed been made. They misread his judgment to mean slavery was illegal in England. And for Sharp, the first unit of Sharp's fiery indignation about the abominable nature, the atrocity of the slave trade, was that it was an indecent violation of the traditions of English common law. The famous phrase was, "The air of England is too pure to breathe, too pure for slaves to breathe." Slavery, that all human subjects of the king were entitled to the same legal dispensation. And you could never in England reduce a man or woman to a thing, to a commodity, to a property. That you were entitled to come under the king's protection. And he believed and argued this it was for him a matter of the integrity of the English/British nation, that this should be upheld. And he finally believes he has his victory in the case of Somerset. What's terribly interesting, historians have discovered, way before me, and that was that the news of the Somerset decision, the vindication of the common law, went all the way into the world of the slaves in the southern United States. Because we know there are many, many runaway advertisements for runaway slaves in Virginia and the Carolinas, which report Pompey or Cato or Suki or Sally running away to British ships in the false belief that slavery is outlawed in Old England. So the masters themselves had caught something. Remember, you know, we're not just talking about a population of enserfed field hands in the black population. Many of them are river pilots, dockers, stevedores, sailors. There are large numbers of blacks in this transatlantic world, in the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine. There are many, many ways, and many of them are self-taught. We don't know how many, but there are many ways in which, indeed, the world of the slaves could have caught this inkling of information. It was why, when in the beginning of the Revolutionary War, cynically and expediently, the last governor of Virginia, down to his last few hundred redcoats, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation offering freedom to all slaves who could escape from rebel plantations and serve under the Union Jack in some form or other. It was why first tens, then hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of such escaped slaves try and make their way through to British lines during the war. It's the first great mass migration and rebellion, if you call voting with your feet a form of rebellion. It doesn't matter how brutally we betray them, and we do, how much distress and destitution and smallpox-ridden catastrophe they are walking into. From the beginning of the war to the very last months of the war, but, you know, the numbers are in contention, but they're certainly not less than 50,000, and maybe as many as 70 or 80,000. 40,000 men are under arms in the American war, approximately. Goes up to 50, including Hessians. And something like 20,000 of those working as sappers and drummers, but also as cavalry dragoons and sometimes infantrymen, are black. Makes you think rather differently about redcoats, doesn't it? Some of them are in uniform, some are not during the war. Anyway, that is why there is this great response. And there is a moment, you know, historians are quite rightly prone to be sardonic when the mood of self-congratulatory national saintliness comes over us, especially in this country, and good for us too. It's sort of, you know, instinctively repugnant to the sceptical mentality, which is the oxygen of the historical profession, or certainly ought to be. But there is one moment which we can forever really feel good about, and it's a moment at the end of the war, 1783, and Washington is arranging, it was that duck-paddled summit conference I was talking about in Old Japan, where Washington and Guy Carleton meet. And they were meeting in order to discuss, as Washington thought, the implications of Article 7 of the Provisional Peace Treaty of Paris, which had been negotiated there by Franklin and others, which said there shall be no it was a last-minute addition to the treaty, actually. It said there should be no carrying off of property or Negroes, unquote. So the notion was that, to start with, the 3,000 freed slaves who were living under British protection in New York, for the first time legally married, their babies legally baptized, many of them carrying little certificates, which were called initialed BB, born free behind British lines, would remain free. And Washington's idea, because he was being shouted at by his fellow slave owners in Virginia, was that they were all going to be returned at the end of the war to their masters. There was a very moving quotation, which it's too late, by Boston King, who is one of those slaves and who became a Methodist minister. And Boston King describes how seeing slave catchers in the street of New York was an absolute terrifying thing, and the spectacles of slaves being seized from their beds, houses broken into, dragged off to the ships. And Boston King expresses himself, possibly overly grateful to the British for issuing passports, because what Sir Guy Carleton says to George Washington, when Washington raises this issue, says, "My dear General, I must be misunderstanding you, but you're surely not suggesting..." He had this way of patronising George Washington, which absolutely drove Washington mad. So I'm sure you can't possibly be suggesting that His Majesty's government should actually violate a solemn undertaking to people, he said, of all colour who'd served under His Majesty's flag. Now, that had really not been said before in official or unofficial hearing at all. And what was Washington to do? There were still 18,000 troops and a lot of ships off Staten Island. He could start the war, but the Continental Army had been disbanded. He wasn't in a position, really, to restart the war. So, grinding his teeth, and with a guilty conscience, as we know about slaves himself, or a conflicted conscience, he accepts this as a fait accompli, and the slaves go to yet more, freed slaves, to more difficulties, which I write about in my book, to Nova Scotia. So all this began really as an act of the recovery of the dignity of the common law under Granville Sharp's auspices. Then religion is very, very important, obviously to Wilberforce, to Thomas Clarkson too. For Sharp, and most of the people actually who are involved, some of them are famously dissenters. Wesley, for example, publishes a ferocious attack on slavery itself in 1774. I'll want to quote Wesley a little just in a minute or two, so I won't now. But by and large, Clarkson was supposed to have been ordained as an Anglican cleric. Most of them are within the Church of England. The one exception are the Quakers. The Quakers will forever earn the proper recognition of history, as from the 17th century onwards being immediately out there really in attacking. It didn't prevent some Quakers actually from owning slaves, but they're very prominent on both sides of the Atlantic in the early abolitionist movement. Essentially what affronted both Quakers and Granville Sharp was the notion that there should be any distinction of colour whatsoever in the access of all sinners to God's grace. We're all sinful. We all deserve the same act of intercessionary compassion embodied in the sacrifice of the Saviour. The meaning of the Passion was, this is the day after Yom Kippur, so forgive me for getting the slightly lapsed Jew version of this. As I understand it, you Christians out there, the meaning of your own particular peculiar form of sacrificial ritual was that God the Father delivered his Son to crucifixion as an act of compassion, as an act of salvation, so that the sins of mankind could be redeemed. It's a very moving thing. So for that, the notion that you sort of made distinctions about which colour you had to be in order to qualify for saving grace, for amazing grace, was deeply offensive to seriously believing Christians. Now, in this country now, we historians, goodness, doesn't time fly when you're having fun? I've been having fun. You poor people may not be. We're the most secular country in Europe. We're constantly sneering at the Americans wrongly, I think, for them all being not merely massively obese, but fanatically deluded, ranting and raving about God. But we're sort of, and, in the 60s, no one did religious history at Christ Cambridge unless they were doing the Reformation. Then they went to do it with Geoffrey Elton at Clare. Unless they were working. They did it a bit if you're talking about Cromwell and the Civil War, but it was always thought under the influence of Christopher Hill then that religious hysteria in the Civil War was some sort of epiphenomenon, some disguise for class interests or some complicated shift in the nature of balance between social groups, or just about political power. But it was intensively about religion, of course. I remember there was a good friend, a very distinguished historian called Edward Royal, who worked on Methodism, was himself, I think, a Methodist. And God, we gave him a terribly hard time for sort of such a peculiar, as though he was sort of, doing sort of studies in higher Hinduism or something. We thought it had nothing to do with what really should be done. And how stupid and blighted and obtuse we were, really. Especially if we had to really recover the history of the late 18th